Hi y'all, it's Kim here, and I'm going to do a demonstration on making a bowl today. I also want to show you how you can use a simple template and actually modify it to make other kinds of objects. So I've started a bowl, and sort of fast started a bowl. I'm going to finish the bottom, and then I'm going to take a modified template and actually show you how I can make a little small basket, which is something I particularly like to make. And so the interesting part about using templates in your work is that just by small modifications and small approaches to different aspects of the form that you can actually really transform it into like completely different things. So I'm going to start with my templates. My bowl template is pretty simple. Once again, it's just a piece of plastic that I've cut out, and you can see that this is the same template for my design, my ceramics 1 and 2 students at St. Petersburg College that they already have in their packet of stuff. So this is the beginning template, and that's what I've used to create this form right here, which I've already done my slip transfer and actually just rolled it into a bowl, and it's sitting upside down. For the basket that I'm going to make today, you can see that this particular template is just a bit smaller than the bowl, but also it has a little bit different contour on the top. So I actually have one area that's higher than the other, and that's to create sort of a more undulating rim and also to give it a little bit more of an organic feel. So I'm going to start with this, finishing this up. I've already seamed this here. You can see that with this particular design, I've actually have a design that goes across the seam, so it sort of modifies that and kind of hides it a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and set up the feet. So I've got some water here. I'm going to go ahead and pull these out. Now, one other thing that's really important to kind of understand about any ceramic construction is the fact that the clay itself actually shrinks as it fires. And in the case of a wood-fired pot, and this particular stoneware that I'm using, the shrinkage rate is about 15%, or literally about a fifth of the size. So that's important to realize when you're creating your templates and coming up with the scale of your forms, that you sort of take that into consideration, so you don't end up, instead of making a cereal bowl, make something that may be more suitable for maybe wasabi or some sauce. So I've got this sort of set up, and I'm going to go ahead and grab my torch and torch this edge. And this is very similar to what I did with both the coffee mug and the tumbler that I showed you in previous videos. So I'm going to go ahead and modify this a little bit once I get that sort of set up a little, and just carve these out. Now I love making bowls like this because of this bottom, which gives it a little bit of lift and space underneath the bottom of the bowl itself. But also, I like a lot of people, picking my bowl up if I've got soup or even cereal in it, and literally being able to drink the rest of the material out of the bowl. So I'm going to go ahead and punch that in, and I actually reduce this a little bit. So I reduce this profile of the foot so it's a little bit smaller, and the bowl has a little bit more elegant feel. But you can see by the way the clay is giving that it's still quite soft, so I'm going to have to hit it again with this torch. I particularly like using soft slabs because I'm able to contour the forms while I'm making, and also because I go ahead and set up this decoration prior to making the piece, the decoration itself is able to stretch with the clay and sort of modify itself with the form. And I think that's particularly important. So I've got a small square of clay here that I'm going to use for the foot. And there's a couple little tips that you can have keep in mind when you're trying to put together the scale, the size of the foot. I sometimes take a tool and I'll just mark kind of the square itself. It's relatively square, so I know I have about this much space to go across, and I just make sure that the piece of clay that I have is a little bit larger than that so I don't end up short on the bottom. So I'm going to compress this on both sides, just like any kind of slab work. It's important to remember to do that. And it's relatively soft, and I'm just going to lay this on the top and then work my way around with my finger by rolling my finger down into those contours So I could line this soft clay up with the edge of the bowl and create a little mark that allows me, gives me a cut guideline. So at this point, I've kind of rolled this slab. I'm gonna use this tool to mark the side which lines up with my seam, and that's just simply to make it easier when I put it together afterwards. And I'm gonna go ahead and pull this off. And you can see the mark here, it's rather faint, but I'm gonna use this as a guide to cut out the shape of my foot. So I lay this flat, and as usual, I always pick up my needle tool to cut curves, and I'm gonna cut a little bit to the outside of this edge and just roll it around. And then just take away the excess clay. Drop it in my bowl. And I've got this form here, which I'm gonna go ahead and use a damp sponge and soften the edge of that. And probably if you've been watching these videos, I have a pretty distinctive style or shape that I go back to. And all of my functional wear has a real similarity and approaches both to the lip and to the feet itself. I like doing these 4 feet because I think it animates the pot quite a bit, gives it a real sense of movement, and also is slightly anthropomorphic. In other words, it refers to other creatures in the world that have 4 feet. So I know that a pedestal of 3 feet actually balances a little bit better than 4. If anyone's ever tried to make a table, they realize that. It's really hard sometimes to make a table where all the legs are level and it doesn't rock. If you do a tripod, it will never rock. It will always balance out. So I'm gonna go ahead and score this edge and make sure that I smooth out the clay that you will see in the bottom of the bowl, and I'm gonna go ahead and score this as well. So this clay is still quite a bit soft, and I'm probably gonna hit it one more time with a torch before I actually attach the foot to it. I'm gonna score those in a couple of different directions, and then once that's scored, I'm gonna go ahead and lay my joining slip on the edge of this slab itself. So as in my previous videos, the mixture that I use to make my joining slip is really quite simple. It's just dried clay body. In this particular case, a white stoneware that's suitable for a wood kiln. And then I let it dry out completely. Then I pound it into powder, and then I rehydrate it with just plain white vinegar. So you can see this little mark right here, that's gonna line up on my seam, and so I know automatically how to line this foot slab onto the bottom of the piece. And I'm gonna be very careful because this clay is quite soft, as I said before. I'm just gonna ease this around and try to make a good join. And then once it's pretty much laying on top of that, I'm just gonna go ahead and softly bend the slab around. Now, when I'm building with these slabs, I have to keep a couple of things in mind. One, I don't want them to be quite that heavy. You know, I like to have lighter weight functional wear in my hand. I don't really like heavy stuff. So the slabs are kind of thin. They're probably about maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, or maybe 3/8. Well, not 3/8, actually 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch thick. That seems to be sort of sufficient. I think any thicker than that for these small forms like a bowl, it's just too much. You can see I've kind of rounded those out, and I'll sort of shape them a little bit. I'm not going to shape them completely because I can do that at the end of this building process, and I'm just going to take my finger and kind of run it down in the middle just so I make a good strong join. And then before I turn this over, I'm going to go ahead and hit it with a torch just so it's set up. And I want to make sure that's sufficiently set up so it doesn't collapse under itself. It's very easy to go a little too fast with this technique. And then I'm just going to carefully pick up the bowl and flip it over. So you can see it's a pretty nice wide open bowl. You can see the interior actually the seam is pretty prominent, and I'm gonna spend a little time cleaning that up. So I'm just gonna set this down. I'm gonna take my tool, which is this wooden modeling tool, and I stick my finger underneath the foot and go ahead and take the tool and smooth that seam out. And I wanna work pretty quickly because I know this clay is wet, but it's thin and it is setting up as I'm moving because I still have some shaping and refining to do on the bowl shape itself. So once that's connected, I'm gonna go ahead and use a little bit of clay and fill in the indentations by the feet. And if I pick this up, you can kind of see that down at the very bottom. Those need to be filled because otherwise food would get trapped in there and it just would be not a very good functional piece. So I'm just gonna roll some balls of clay, try to make them as even as possible, but it doesn't actually matter too much. Just a quick roll, and then I'm gonna taper each one of those balls. And the reason I taper them is so they can fit into that indentation where the foot is, and it doesn't have any kind of air pockets. So I'm just gonna take this tapered ball and stick my wooden modeling tool on it just so it's easy to hold, and dip it into my joining slip and actually just push it down into the interior of this bowl. And I'll just do that with all of these until the clay actually is put in at each place, and I'll spend a little bit of time refining the bottom so it's smooth. When you're making bowls, the thing that you see actually is the interior. I mean, and so it's important that you spend a lot of time refining that interior, making it as smooth as possible, making sure that the seam is covered and it's strongly connected, that these little balls of clay are actually pushed in there and compressed quite a bit, and that the bottom of the pot and the pot itself have a really good strong join. And that's particularly important in any kind of firing, but especially when you go to high temperature firing because of all of the stresses that the clay goes through in the firing process itself. So I think about that in terms of just those stresses. I mean, essentially they're geological in nature. I mean, we're firing these pieces up to almost 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you look inside of a kiln, it's almost white hot, which is quite hot. It's almost beyond comprehension. And it needs to be that high in temperature to actually cause the transformation that occurs with clay when it's fired. So I'm taking my sponge and I'm just quickly going through here and smoothing all this out. And you can see that rather quickly the clay smooths and the form becomes really a little bit less marred up. And I'll have to work on this seam a little bit. So I'm gonna pick up my rib, and it's a clean rib, it's a little bit damp. I'm gonna go ahead and smooth this out. And this rib, once again, is a way for me to stretch and shape the pot. So I've got my hand gently on the outside. I'm sort of supporting what I'm doing in the interior. And I'm moving around. And you can see how this turntable is actually quite helpful because you're able to move with very light pressure in a very consistent circle. The final aspect of this shaping process is basically looking at the rim of the pot. I'm gonna make sure that seam is smooth. And also to make sure that it's fairly round. And I've got my tool, which I use to make sure that this is a pretty round bowl. And you can see what's really kind of nice about this is it literally fits on the interior of this form. It's just basically a way to hold it in round. And then I'm able to hit it with the torch a little bit to sort of stiffen up the clay before I finish the rim. a little piece of wet chamois leather, and this is going to be how I kind of compress this rim. Now, as in the previous videos, I've gone ahead and pre-compressed this rim to the interior. I think that's kind of nice. But one of the things I like to do is make sure there's a very distinctive transition between the lip of the pot and the interior and the exterior. And I think this is important because you need to set up a kind of solution to what you do with the glazing in the interior. So this is going to have a liner glaze on it. It'll be a different color than the outside. But this lip becomes a transition point, and you have to make all sorts of decisions about it. One decision is, will the glaze go over the lip? You know, that's a solution that you can make with your pot. Will the glaze go over to the exterior of the pot? That's another sort of approach. But you need to know or have a decision made before you actually make, because you have to sort of set the solution up to glazing. What I like to do is glaze the interior of the pot right up to the rim transition point. So I do not glaze this part of the rim, I just glaze the interior. And so I want to have a pretty sharp line so that sort of demarks that boundary, so to speak. And as I've talked to my students in the past, this point of change in the pot is actually quite important. This is basically a liminal space in the pot itself. So that means it's not exactly the interior of the pot, nor is it the exterior of the pot. It's somewhere in between. And so that causes your eye to move to that place. It's an important part to emphasize in your form making. And it's also something that you need to recognize when you're conceiving any piece. So this is, now I would normally spend a little bit more time with this, but I'm just gonna quickly move through that, and that's essentially the bowl. Now at this point I would go through and sort of refine that foot, but I'm not gonna do that right now. I'm just gonna show you that sort of mark of demarcation. So you can see that this rim right here was cleared of glaze. You can see a clear demarcation between the interior and then this place, which is the liminal spot, and then the exterior of the pot itself. And just in terms of shrinkage, I mean, this is the bowl in its finished state, but this is the bowl as it starts. And so you can see that there's quite a bit shrinkage in between those two processes. So oftentimes your functional forms need to be much larger than you think they need to be, just to account for that shrinkage aspect. So what I've got over here is the beginning of what's going to be a small basket. So I love making these little baskets because they become like these little flower vases. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and started a form and really refined it and got to the point where I can do some different things to it, which is actually put on the handle, which I'm going to show you, and also to create this sort of interesting lip, which is actually a rolled slab. Now this is a hard thing to deal with, but once again, you know, I was faced with a sort of a problem, like what do I do with this liminal space, this lip? You know, how do I address that? And how do I sort of think about the interior and the exterior? And if you look in the interior of this pot, you can see that it has this beautiful blue, sort of chun blue glaze, and that lip sort of rolls in and kind of caps it. And I don't really like having a sharp lip right here, mostly because it might chip, but I also wanted to make it a little beefier statement. So this is what we're going for, this little small basket, and this is the beginning. So I've got this piece right here, and it's leather hard enough. It's not really flexible, but it's still soft enough for joining. And I'm gonna go ahead and get ready to put a lip on it. So I'm gonna move this plastic out of the way, clean up my workspace. And I've got a piece of a slab of clay over here. And it's just a normal slab of clay in the normal sort of way I roll it out. But in this state, it's actually way too thick, and I'm gonna have to modify it a little bit. And I've also have to make a decision, like how long of a slab do I need to go around the circumference of this basket circle. So one of the things that you can do is, just as a quick sort of measurement is I've got, it's about 4 inches of going across the long way since it's a little bit oval, and you can kind of see it right there. And it's about 3 inches the other way. So basically I'm gonna sort of fudge it 3.5 inches. And I know that the circumference of a circle is roughly 3 times the diameter. So my diameter I've sort of agreed is 3.5 inches. So 3 times that would be about 14 inches long. So I've got a slab that's about that, and it's relatively thick. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and throw this out a little bit. And you can see it's elongating with every stretch. And I'm actually gonna make this quite thin. And so I wanna go ahead and just use my rolling pin and just sort of roll that out a little thinner. And you can see it's getting pretty thin. It'll get quite a bit thinner actually. So I've got this slab of clay, and I'm gonna go ahead and refine it right now because it's easier. And it's also important that this slab of clay is soft because I'm gonna require it to not only roll around the rim, but also roll over the rim. So it's gotta roll in 2 different ways. So I'm gonna use my ruler, and I'm just basically gonna cut a slab that's way longer than I need, but I'm gonna use the width of the ruler as a sort of way of measuring. I'm gonna make it just a little bit thicker, so I'm just gonna roll this down just a little bit. Go ahead and cut that. It's important to cut straight. You want it to be relatively uniform. So I've got this long slab of clay, which I know is way longer than needs to go around, which is good. So that gives me a chance to cut off a little bit of this extra clay. And to think about this a little bit. So I think this clay is okay, but it's a little bit thick. So I'm gonna go to my pony roller, which is a little easier to control, and I'm pulling the clay as I'm rolling it. Now, because I want this to go in a circle around here, and I do need to thin this clay out, what I've done is I'm going to make a move that actually allows me to do this. So I'm gonna hold this end, and I'm gonna start at this end, and actually what I'm gonna do as I'm rolling it is I'm gonna pull the clay around in a circle. Now what this does, all clay has a memory, and it allows me to sort of set the memory in without tearing the clay. And every time I do this, of course, it's thinning the clay out, which is the way I need it to be. And you can see actually you can make a pretty sharp turn with this without being too tearing the clay at all. Let's just hope this works because it's a little bit hard. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut off this excess. And I'm gonna go ahead and take it over to my pot and just do a quick measurement to see how it works. And I've got quite a bit of extra clay, and I'll go ahead and take some of this off. It's always easier to have too much than not enough, so that's important. And I always give myself a little bit of a leeway with this because I actually don't want to run out. So now I've got this slab set up, and I'm going to go ahead and do the refining on it prior to putting it on the clay. So I'm going to take my chamois, and I'm just going to wrap it around my thumbnail, and I'm going to go ahead and press a groove around the edge. I like that groove because it gives a little transition and it actually rounds off the edge. I'm going to do the same thing on the interior, so it also has a nice smooth transition to the body of the pot. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and designate one of these ends as the end that you see. So I'm going to go ahead and groove that out as well. So sometimes you have to go over a little bit. It may miss, but that's basically it in a nutshell. And you can see this clay is quite soft and very thin. So you have to be very careful with it at this point so it does not tear. So now what I'm going to do is go to my piece, and I'm going to go ahead and put a score mark on it so I can get ready to attach this to the rim. So I score in the interior, and you can see it's tapered. and a little bit to the inside of that, and a little bit to the outside too. I don't want to go too far. And I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to score it on in the same way. I'm going to score it both ways. And I'm going to go ahead and add my slip, my joining slip to the base of this. I'm going to fold it so the scores are out towards the pot, and then just lift it and put it right into the inside. So one of the things that's really difficult about slabs is when you're putting them on things, especially round things, and you're trying to make a hollow tube, the tendency is really for the pot to tear and fold. And I don't really want that to happen. I want this to be a nice continuous curve, and I don't want to have like ripples in the rim itself. And so what I do is I don't really attach it at first. I just lay it onto the pot and start the attachment process later. So this is the end, so I'm going to go ahead and start here. And I'm going to pinch and almost like pick this up so I can sort of pull some of that thickness out. There's a little bit here. I'm gonna go ahead and roll this around. And then just roll it down. And sort of just work my way around it slowly with patience. This takes a little bit of time. You see it makes a pretty smooth transition. Now in order to make this, like, make sure that it's attached, I'm just gonna go take my chamois leather and like run around that bead that I already pre-established, and sort of just make sure that moves down. There's a couple little ripples here, I'll fix them in a minute. And just make sure that it's like made a good joint. Now you can see right here there's a little bit of an air pocket, and the reason I leave that there is because this is a hollow slab lip, and so I do not want this to trap air and blow off the pot. So I allow that little space so the air can actually, the steam actually when the clay is firing can escape and it won't blow up the pot rim. Just going to do a little bit of work here, smooth that out a bit, come through and do a little more refining. That's not too bad. And so I've got a rim sort of attached to this, and it's now ready to create the handle itself. So I'm gonna move this clay out of the way, and I've got some clay over here I prepared. I went ahead and wedged it and started rolling it up. The handle that I'm going to put on is a kind of a hybrid handle between a pulled and a coiled handle. So I'm going to start with just a piece of clay like this, and I'm roughing it out a bit. And I'm just going to roll a coil. That's pretty even. And it's important to start rolling from the middle and work your hands out to the edges. That keeps it round. And I'm just sort of setting this up so I can actually pull this quite a bit thinner in just a minute. This is obviously a lot of clay. I'm going to move this off to the side. Let's move this here because I'm going to need my turntable as a way of making this. So I've got this piece of clay like this, and I'm going to go ahead and take some water and wet my hands and literally pull the coil. So this coil needs to be quite thinned. Probably have way too much clay here, but sort of move with that. And you can see by wetting my hand, just sliding my hands down the clay, I'm able to stretch this clay out. And I keep turning in my hand to keep it as regular as possible, as even as possible. And at first, just like throwing out a slab, when you're stretching the clay out, the clay does not want to stretch, but then it starts stretching pretty easily once you get it moving. And I'm going to cut out off this thick end on the bottom. I'm really just looking for this middle part is what I'm trying to, and that's kind of good. You can see how much thinner this is and how much more regular it is. It's actually kind of amazing to me every time I do this. And I've got this pretty long, regular coil. And I mean, I use this technique quite a bit for different kinds of things. So I've got this clay. This part of the clay is unusable. This part of the clay is unusable. So I'm gonna get rid of those. So if I were to just cut straight, it's gonna flatten out. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna score a little bit of a line and actually just, and turn it over and score another line and actually just twist this off. That gets rid of that and enables me to refine this a little bit more. So I'm gonna go ahead and roll this out. See, the clay is wet, sort of sticking to my drywall. No big deal. I'm gonna go ahead and lay this on my turntable. Now what I like about this turntable is it's got concentric circles on it, and I use those as a way to shape this. And I also know that my handles themselves end on this. So if they go to this top and roll them around, I know by experience that that's basically how big I want them. And so I'm just gonna go ahead and take my knife and cut that extra clay off. And the bottom is quite thick and sort of bulky at this point. I'm gonna go ahead and sort of smooth that. So I take my fingers and sort of pinch that out, kind of give it a little bit of a flare. And I'm gonna go back and probably refine that just a little bit in just a minute. So I've got this rather wet, soft handle at this point. And because this is a metal turntable, I'm gonna go ahead and torch it right on the metal turntable. Give it a little bit of stiffness so it's not quite as sticky. And I'm gonna go use my rib once again, and I'm gonna use the rib to actually give this a shape. So I'm gonna roll this around. I just kind of flatten that out a bit. And I just sort of carefully move that around. You can see that it changes the contour just a bit. Smooth off that edge. And just work my way around. And at this point, I'm just gonna hit it with the torch one more time. Then I'm gonna turn it over. So I pick it up carefully. They usually stick down, and I just replicate the space, and I go back to my smoothing tool, my rib, and I just go ahead and make that contour. This is probably one of the most enjoyable parts of this whole building process, is creating these handles. They're kind of extravagant, and baskets in a certain sense are fairly extravagant forms anyway, because they don't seem to have that much of a purpose, especially a small basket. It's not as if I would use this to gather food or something, but they make really great flower vases or a place to arrange flowers. And I think because the handle gives it a sort of a vertical element, and then the flowers can sort of interact with the handle itself. So you can make these beautiful asymmetrical arrangements. And as some of you guys know, I'm a gardener. I have a lot of extensive gardens all around the house, and my hobby of gardening actually finds itself in the work, and that's why I have a lot of flowers on my pieces. I basically take photographs of the things blooming in my yard, and they find their way in the work. So I'm gonna go ahead and refine this bottom, pinch this, and I'll clean it up. It's a little bit rough. It always is at this point. It's okay. It's just part of the process. Soften. And so now I have this basket handle, and I'm gonna go ahead and hit it with the torch again. So this is a demonstration, and I'm hoping I've hit it enough so it actually has a little bit of contour, but you can see it's sort of holding its shape softly. I still have to be quite delicate with it. So I'm gonna move that out of the way. I'm gonna bring my form over here, and I'm just gonna carefully place this on my work table, just over to the side. And this is still quite soft, so what I'm going to do is hit that rim with some wire. And just like this piece, you can see that the basket itself sort of falls over the top of that rim and over that, and that's basically what I'm going to do with this particular thing. So I'm going to pinch this out a little bit more. Clean up any roughness, because it's much easier to clean up at this stage than it is a little bit later. And I'm gonna pick this up. I'm gonna place it on my basket, just for eyeballing. So I know that this is gonna sort of grab hold down here, and I'm gonna have this grab hold over here. You can see that this is quite soft still, so I might have to hit that a little bit. But I'm just placing it just to lightly to eyeball it. And I'm just gonna take a tool and just score a little bit of a mark so I have a place that this goes back. So I know. Go ahead and remove that carefully. And I'm going to hit this rim one more time. So at this point, I can go ahead and score. I'm going to go back over here. I'm gonna go ahead and score the edge of my basket handle. I'm gonna hit it one more time with the torch. Then I'm gonna get my scoring slip and add it to these two places. And shockingly, it amazes me always. I just take my hand and gently pinch this down. The clay, it's still super soft at this point. You have to be really careful. You have to let it dry slowly. But what this allows me to do, because this clay is so soft, is I'm able to tweak the handle a little bit. So I can actually create a little bit more of a gesture in it just by bending it slightly. And what I particularly like is this round edge there. I don't want to mess that up. And then the very last thing I do before I would finish it for the day is go ahead and hit it with a torch. And then bag it and let it dry slowly so this has a chance to all hydrate. So that's it. in a nutshell, you can use the template of the bowl, modify it, create other kinds of objects with it, just by modifying the way you deal with the lip and then adding handles and maybe even just changing the top contour of the piece. You can actually make a completely different form. So I hope this helps you out, and I hope you explore like many different ways of using those bowl templates. And I'll see you the next time I do this. Bye.